Have you ever stopped at a gas station or roadside diner in the middle of the night and felt something off? That eerie silence, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and the unsettling feeling that you're being watched. Most of us shrug it off as paranoia, but sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes those pit stops hide something far darker than you could ever imagine. It's easy to forget how vulnerable we are during those brief stops, stepping out of the safety of our car into the unknown, surrounded by strangers, shadows, and the emptiness of the open road. For some, these moments are just routine. For others, they become the stuff of nightmares. In today's video, we're diving into 5 chilling pit stop stories you'll wish weren't true. These aren't just urban legends or campfire tales. Every story is based on real-life encounters. Unsettling, horrifying, and hauntingly believable. They'll make you think twice before pulling over at a deserted gas station or diner. Again, why? Because these stories aren't just about bad luck. They're about those rare moments when the mundane shifts into something sinister. A simple pit stop for gas or a late-night coffee break suddenly spirals into danger, a fight for survival, or worse. Throughout this video, we'll uncover encounters with strangers whose intentions were anything but friendly, vehicles that seem to have a life of their own, and even brushes with the inexplicable. Each tale is a reminder of how quickly a safe, ordinary moment can turn into something far more terrifying. And here's the thing. The scariest part about these stories isn't just what happens. It's the fact that they could happen to anyone. By the end of this video, you'll have more than enough reasons to keep your car doors locked, your wits sharp, and your eyes open every time you hit the road. But a word of caution, the stories you're about to hear are not for the faint of heart. They'll linger in your mind long after the video ends, making every pit stop feel a little less safe, a little less ordinary. So are you ready? Let's dive into our first story, a late-night gas station visit that spiraled into a living nightmare. The stalker at the gas station. It started as an ordinary road trip. Emma, a 22-year-old college student, was driving home after visiting her parents for the weekend. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of her, and the late-night sky was pitch black, save for the occasional passing cars. Headlights. The rhythmic hum of her tires on the asphalt was comforting at first, but as the hours dragged on, a sense of unease began to creep in. Her fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, and she spotted a gas station sign glowing faintly in the distance. Relieved, she made her way toward it, grateful for the chance to refuel and stretch her legs. As she approached, however, the station's desolate appearance gave her pause. It was the only structure around for miles, just a small, run-down building with flickering lights and a couple of old pumps. Emma hesitated. There was no one else in sight. No attendants, no other cars, nothing but the hum of the neon sign overhead. She told herself she was overthinking it. There was no other option anyway. She pulled in, parked by one of the pumps, and began filling up her tank. The night was colder than she'd expected, and the air was eerily still. As she stood there, Emma felt a prickle of unease, as if she were being watched. She glanced around, but the lot was empty. Just shadows stretching out in every direction. She shook her head, chalking it up to nerves, and focused on finishing up as quickly as possible. That's when she noticed him. A man, standing just beyond the edge of the station's dim lights, partially obscured by the shadows. He was tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, and his face was hidden. At first, Emma thought he might be waiting for his turn at the pump. But there were no other cars in sight, and he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching her. Emma's grip tightened on the pump nozzle as a shiver ran down her spine. She told herself to stay calm, to finish what she was doing and leave. She paid quickly at the kiosk and got back into her car, locking the doors as soon as she was inside. She glanced in her rearview mirror, hoping the man was gone. But he wasn't. He was walking toward her car. Her heart pounded as she started the engine, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She pulled out of the lot as quickly as she could, her tires crunching over the gravel. In her mirrors, she saw the man stop and stand motionless, watching her drive away. Relief washed over her as the station disappeared behind her. Maybe he was just a weirdo. Maybe it was nothing. But the relief didn't last. 10 minutes down the road, Emma noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. At first, they were far behind her, but as the minutes passed, the car crept closer. She told herself it was just a coincidence. Highways weren't exactly deserted, even at night. Someone else could easily be heading in the same direction, but the car didn't pass her. Instead, it stayed behind, matching her speed. Emma's pulse quickened. She switched lanes, hoping the car would go around her, but it followed, maintaining its position. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. This wasn't coincidence. Emma decided to test her theory. She slowed down, hoping the car would pass, but it slowed down, too. Her breathing became shallow as panic set in. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just another driver, they were following her. With trembling hands, Emma grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she explained the situation to the operator, who instructed her to stay calm and avoid stopping under any circumstances. "Is there a well-lit area or a populated stop you can head to?" the operator asked. Emma scanned the road ahead, her heart sinking. The highway stretched on empty and barren. "No," she whispered, "there's nothing out here." The car behind her swerved slightly, as if trying to intimidate her. She could feel her throat tighten with fear. What did they want? Was this just a cruel prank, or was she in real danger? The operator reassured her, promising to send help, but the closest officers were miles away. Emma knew she was on her own for now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spotted a faint glow on the horizon, a 24-hour diner. The neon sign felt like a lifeline. "I see a diner," she said, her voice cracking. The operator instructed her to pull in and park as close to the entrance as possible. Emma's tires screeched as she pulled into the lot, her headlights flooding the area with light. She parked near the door and glanced in her mirror. The car behind her had slowed down but didn't pull in. Instead, it lingered on the highway for a moment before speeding off into the night. Emma sat frozen, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She stared at the empty highway, half expecting the car to return. When it didn't, she finally stepped out and walked into the diner, her legs trembling beneath her. Inside, the warmth and noise of the diner were a stark contrast to the cold terror she'd just escaped. A kind waitress brought her a cup of coffee as she waited for the police to arrive. When they did, they took her statement but admitted there wasn't much they could do. The car had no license plate, and without more information, the driver's identity would likely remain a mystery. To this day, Emma has no idea who was following her or what they wanted. But every time she passes a gas station at night, she feels that same shiver down her spine. She never stops unless she absolutely has to, and when she does, she makes sure she's never alone. The gas station attendant Chris was no stranger to late-night drives. As a long-haul truck driver, he was used to empty roads, long stretches of silence, and the occasional eerie encounter. But nothing could have prepared him for the night he stopped at a tiny, out-of-the-way gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was around 2 a.m. when Chris pulled into the station. His truck rumbled to a stop next to one of the ancient, weathered pumps. The station itself looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The sign flickered weakly, casting a faint glow over the cracked asphalt. The surrounding area was pitch black, save for the dim lights of the station, and aside from his truck, the lot was empty. Chris stepped out of his truck, stretching his stiff legs before starting to fill his tank. As the gas flowed, he looked around, his eyes drifting toward the station building. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked, the windows grimy and streaked. Behind the counter sat a lone attendant, a young woman who seemed far too young to be working the graveyard shift alone. Her long dark hair framed her pale face, and she was hunched over a magazine, barely moving. The sight of her gave Chris pause. Something about the scene felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Shrugging off the feeling, he decided to head inside for a quick snack and to pay for the fuel. As he approached the glass door, the oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier. The soft buzz of the overhead lights was the only sound, broken occasionally by the faint rustling of the wind. When he opened the door, the bell jingled sharply, startling him. The Sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The attendant didn't look up. "Hey there," Chris greeted her, trying to sound casual as he grabbed a bag of chips and a bottle of water. He approached the counter, placing the items in front of her. She glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable, her eyes strangely empty. She rang up his purchase in silence, her movements mechanical and slow. Chris felt a shiver creep down his spine as he watched her. There was something unsettling about her demeanor. She finally handed him his change, her cold fingers brushing against his. It was then that Chris decided to break the silence. "Quiet night, huh?" The girl hesitated, then spoke in a low, almost robotic voice. "You should leave." Her words hit Chris like a jolt. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What?" She didn't repeat herself, instead staring at him with a chilling intensity. The silence stretched on, the air between them thick with tension. Chris let out a nervous chuckle, brushing it off as a weird interaction. "All right then, thanks." He turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, her voice came again, this time a whisper. "Don't go back to your truck." Chris froze mid-step, his pulse quickening. He turned back toward the counter, but she was gone. The stool she'd been sitting on was empty, the counter now vacant. His heart pounded as he scanned the room. There was no sign of her anywhere. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before buzzing back to life. Chris didn't wait to figure out what was happening. He bolted for the door, stepping back into the cold night air. His truck was still parked by the pump, but as he approached, his stomach dropped. The passenger door, which he was certain he'd locked, was now slightly ajar. Chris stopped in his tracks, his eyes locked on the shadowy interior of the cab. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of something shifting inside. His breath caught in his throat. Instinctively, he retreated back to the gas station's entrance, his hands fumbling for his phone. He pulled it out to call the police, but when he looked at the screen, he realized he had no signal. His frustration and fear mounted as he glanced nervously between his truck and the dark road stretching beyond the station. Minutes passed. The shadow inside his truck didn't move again. Chris tried to convince himself that he'd imagined it, that the stress of the fuzz of the encounter with the strange attendant was playing tricks on him. Finally summoning his courage, he retrieved the heavy flashlight from his pocket and crept cautiously back toward his vehicle. The beam of light cut through the darkness as Chris peered into the cab. It was empty. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The feeling of being watched still clung to him, prickling at the back of his neck. He quickly climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind him. Chris started the engine, the familiar rumble calm in his nerves slightly. He pulled out of the lot, the gas station fading into the distance as he returned to the highway. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe he just had a bad case of paranoia. But then he noticed something strange. The rearview mirror was angled differently than he'd left it, as if someone had adjusted it. A knot formed in his stomach as he reached up to fix it. When he did, his heart nearly stopped. In the reflection, he saw a figure crouched in the sleeper cab behind him. Chris swerved violently, the truck lurching to one side as he fought to regain control. He whipped around to look, but the sleeper was empty. His breathing was ragged, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. He kept driving, the fear gnawing at him. It wasn't until he reached a crowded rest stop an hour later that he felt safe enough to stop. He parked among the other trucks, got out, and searched every inch of his cab. There was no one there, no sign of forced entry. Chris spent the rest of the night sitting in the diner at the rest stop, surrounded by other drivers. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. How could he? The strange attendant, the flickering lights, the shadow in his truck, it all sounded insane. To this day, Chris refuses to stop at isolated gas stations. Whatever he encountered that night, he doesn't want to face it again. And he can't shake the feeling that something or someone was with him in that truck. The mysterious vehicle Mark was a photographer who loved the thrill of chasing sunsets and sunrises. His work often took him to remote locations where he'd camp overnight to capture the perfect shot. This time, He was heading back from a particularly scenic shoot in the mountains. The winding road was quiet, the sky a deep navy blue speckled with stars, and his mind was still buzzing with the beauty of the landscapes he'd photographed. It was close to midnight when Mark realized he was running low on gas. The glowing fuel light on his dashboard blinked, a reminder of how far he still had to go. The nearest town was miles away, but his GPS directed him to a small, out-of-the-way gas station just a few miles ahead. Reluctantly, he decided to stop there. The gas station came into view, an isolated structure surrounded by dense woods. The lights above the pumps flickered weakly, and the place looked abandoned. Mark pulled in, turning off his car as the engine sputtered. A quick glance around revealed no attendants, no other vehicles, just silence. As he got out of the car to fill up, he noticed an old pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. It looked as though it had been there for years, rusted, with flat tires and a shattered windshield. Mark thought little of it and focused on getting his tank filled as quickly as possible. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stillness of the station was somehow unnatural, as if the world around it were holding its breath. The pump clicked, signaling it was done. Mark returned the nozzle, got back into his car, and started the engine. As he shifted into drive, his headlights swept over the pickup truck. That's when he saw a figure sitting in the driver's seat. His stomach dropped. He was sure no one had been in the truck before. He couldn't make out the person's face in the dim light, but their outline was unmistakable. A chill crept down his spine. Trying to calm himself, Mark convinced himself it was just a homeless person using the truck for shelter. It was none of his business. He pulled out of the lot and headed back onto the highway. The winding road stretched out ahead of him, bordered by tall trees. The darkness was oppressive, broken only by his headlights. Mark tried to shake the eerie feeling from the gas station, but it clung to him like a shadow. Then he saw it. In his rearview mirror, headlights appeared in the distance. The vehicle was moving fast, closing the gap between them. Mark's heart began to race. He accelerated slightly, but the car behind him matched his speed. It was the same pickup truck. How is that possible? Mark muttered to himself, his hands tightening on the wheel. The truck had been rusted, its tires flat. It shouldn't have been able to move. Yet here it was, barreling down the road as though it were brand new. Mark's breathing quickened as he pushed the accelerator. The truck followed suit, its headlights glaring in his mirror. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the outline of the driver, motionless, gripping the wheel. He tried to stay rational. Maybe it was a different truck. Maybe he was imagining things. But the feeling of dread gnawed at him, each passing moment amplifying his fear. The truck swerved suddenly, pulling up alongside him. Mark stole a glance out his window and immediately wished he hadn't. The driver wasn't a person. It was a shadowy figure, featureless and dark, its form almost blending into the night. Where its eyes should have been were two pinpoints of glowing red light. Mark's instincts screamed at him to get away. He slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward as his speed climbed. The truck fell back for a moment, but then it surged forward, its headlights growing larger in his mirrors. The road ahead forked, one path leading toward the highway, the other toward a dead-end overlook. Mark veered sharply toward the highway, his tires screeching on the asphalt. The truck followed but struggled to keep up on the tight curve. For a brief moment, Mark thought he'd lost it, but the relief was short-lived. The truck appeared again, this time inches behind his car. It rammed into his bumper, sending a jolt through the vehicle. Mark's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his heart pounding in his ears. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, desperate to outrun whatever was pursuing him. Ahead, he saw the faint glow of a gas station. Sign another stop, one that seemed far more populated than the last. Mark made a split-second decision and swerved into the lot, his tires screeching as he came to a stop near the entrance. He leapt out of his car and ran inside, breathless and trembling. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, looked up from his magazine. "You okay, buddy?" "There's a truck," Mark stammered. "It's following me." The clerk frowned and walked to the window. Mark followed, his heart hammering in his chest. But when they looked out at the lot, The truck was gone. The highway beyond the station was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights. "You sure you're not imagining things?" the clerk asked, giving Mark a concerned look. Mark didn't know how to respond. He felt the weight of the clerk's skepticism, but he couldn't deny what he'd seen. After taking a few minutes to calm down, he decided to continue his journey. The rest of the drive was uneventful, though every shadow on the road made him flinch. To this day, Mark doesn't know what he encountered that night. He avoids back roads and late-night gas stations whenever possible. And every so often, when he's driving alone at night, he checks his rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at him. The stranger at the rest stop, Lena, loved road trips. She enjoyed the freedom of the open road, the changing landscapes, and the playlist she curated for each journey. But her latest trip, a solo drive across state lines to visit a friend, would leave her with memories far more chilling than anything she'd anticipated. It was late, past 1 a.m., when she decided to pull into a rest stop. She'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was beginning to set in. The next town was still a couple of hours away, and she figured a short break would help her stay alert for the remainder of the drive. The rest stop was desolate. A few vending machines stood under flickering fluorescent lights, and a single restroom building loomed at the far end of the lot. The surrounding trees seemed to close in on the space, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. There were no other cars, no attendants, just Lena and the cold night air. She parked her car near the vending machines, left the engine running, and stepped out to stretch her legs. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. She sipped her water, looking around. That's when she heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the restrooms. Lena froze, her pulse quickening. "Hello?" She called out, her voice echoing in the empty lot. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. She told herself it was probably an animal or the wind playing tricks on her. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Deciding not to linger, Lena grabbed her water and headed back toward her car. That's when she saw him. A man stood at the edge of the shadows, just beyond the light from the vending machines. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, and he wasn't moving. His face was obscured, but Lena could feel his gaze locked on her. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. Lena's heart raced as she quickly got into her car, locking the doors behind her. She glanced at the figure, hoping he would turn and leave. Instead, he began walking toward her. Her hands fumbled as she threw the car into gear, her breath quick and shallow. She drove out of the lot, her tires crunching over the gravel. As she sped away, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the lot, watching her car disappear into the night. But that wasn't the end of it. About 10 minutes later, Lena saw headlights behind her. A car was approaching fast, its high beams glaring in her mirrors. She tried to ignore it, hoping the driver would pass her. Instead, the vehicle slowed and kept pace with her. Her breath hitched. Was it him? How had he followed her when she'd seen no other cars at the rest stop? She pressed down on the gas, her heart pounding in her chest. The other car matched her speed, swerving slightly as it did. Her mind raced, conjuring terrifying possibilities. Was he trying to scare her? Run her off the road? Or worse? Lena reached for her phone to call for help, but she had no signal. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles turning white. She knew she had to stay calm and focused. Her headlights illuminated the empty stretch of highway ahead, but the darkness beyond felt oppressive, almost alive. Ahead, she spotted an exit ramp leading to another rest stop, this one larger and better lit. The sight of the glowing lights felt like salvation. She made a snap decision and veered off the highway, her tires screeching as she took the exit. The other car hesitated at the ramp, its high beams glaring one last time before continuing down the highway. Relief washed over Lena as she pulled into the brightly lit parking lot. She parked near the entrance to a small convenience store and sat there for a moment, trying to calm her nerves. The lot was bustling with activity, other cars, travelers grabbing snacks, and a few truck drivers chatting by their rigs. The presence of other people made her feel safer. Inside, Lena explained what had happened to the cashier, a kindly older man who listened attentively. "You're not the first person to say something like that," he told her. "There've been a few reports of strange people hanging around that rest stop. It's why I never stop there anymore." His words sent a chill through Lena. Who was that man? And how had he managed to follow her so closely? She thanked the cashier, bought a coffee, and resolved to stay there until she felt safe enough to drive again. She sat at a table near the windows, keeping her car in sight. The parking lots, bright lights and constant movement were a welcome contrast to the eerie stillness she'd felt earlier. When she finally got back on the road, the rest of her trip was uneventful. But Lena couldn't shake the memory of that man, how he'd appeared out of nowhere, how he'd followed her without explanation. To this day, Lena avoids stopping at rest stops late at night. And every time she drives alone, she keeps her doors locked, her phone within reach, and her eyes constantly scanning the road behind her, because you never know who or what might be waiting in the shadows. The supernatural encounter Jacob considered himself a skeptic, a no-nonsense type of guy. He didn't believe in ghosts, urban legends, or anything remotely supernatural. So when his friends dared him to take a solo road trip through a supposedly haunted route in the countryside, he accepted without hesitation. For Jacob, it was just another drive. The road, known locally as Hollow Highway, had a dark reputation. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of strange occurrences, cars stalling for no reason, figures appearing on the roadside, and eerie sounds in the dead of night. Jacob dismissed the stories as superstitions meant to scare off travelers. It was a chilly autumn night when he set off. The air was crisp, the moon bright, and the winding road was eerily empty. He'd been driving for hours without issue when his fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank. The next town was still 50 miles away, but his GPS showed a gas station just a few miles ahead. Reluctantly, Jacob decided to stop. The gas station appeared like a mirage on the horizon, a small dilapidated structure with a single pump illuminated by a flickering light. The station looked abandoned, its windows dusty and cracked. A rusted car sat off to the side, covered in leaves and cobwebs. Jacob pulled in and parked by the pump. He stepped out, the cool air nipping at his skin. As he reached for the nozzle, a low, humming sound caught his attention. He paused, glancing around, but saw nothing. The hum faded, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Shrugging it off, Jacob began filling his tank. The pump handle felt ice cold, and the numbers on the meter ticked by sluggishly, as if the machine hadn't been used in years. He glanced toward the station's entrance. Through the grimy glass, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker, like someone passing by. "Hello?" Jacob called out. There was no response. He shook, his head chuckling under his breath. "Get a grip," he muttered. When the tank was full, Jacob walked over to the kiosk to pay. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of mildew and decay hit him instantly. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves sparsely stocked with expired snacks and dusty cans. An old register sat on the counter, but no one was there to man it. "Anyone here?" Jacob called out again, louder this time. His voice echoed in the small space, but the station remained silent. He pulled out his phone to use the station's app for payment, but his screen displayed no signal. Frustrated, Jacob decided to leave cash on the counter. As he reached into his wallet, the low hum from earlier returned, louder now, vibrating through the room. Then the lights went out. The station was plunged into darkness. Jacob's breath caught as he fumbled for his phone's flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing the empty aisles and the cracked walls. The hum had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. And then he heard it, footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed from somewhere deeper in the station. Jacob's flashlight darted around the room, but he saw nothing. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice tinged with unease. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jacob backed toward the door, his heart pounding. As he turned to leave, the sound stopped abruptly. He froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Slowly he turned back. Toward the counter, standing behind it was a figure. It wasn't human. Its form was tall and distorted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing, empty eyes that burned into Jacob's soul. He stumbled back, his mind racing with disbelief. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, before taking a slow step forward. Jacob didn't wait to see what it wanted. He bolted out of the station, the door slamming shut behind him. He scrambled into his car, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. As he sped out of the lot, the gas station grew smaller in his rearview mirror, but the terror wasn't over. A loud thud jolted his car, and he glanced in the mirror. The figure was clinging to the trunk, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Jacob swerved wildly, the tires screeching as he tried to shake it off. The figure didn't budge. In a desperate move, Jacob slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop threw the figure forward, and it disappeared into the darkness. Jacob didn't wait to see if it would return. He hit the gas and drove as fast as he could, his hands trembling on the wheel. The rest of the drive was a blur. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of a crowded diner in the next town. There, surrounded by the chatter of other patrons and the clinking of silverware, Jacob finally allowed himself to breathe. When he told his story to the locals, they exchanged uneasy glances. One elderly man leaned in and said, "You're lucky. Not everyone who meets the Hollow Highway Spectre makes it out." Jacob didn't respond. He couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes or the feeling of being watched. He never took that route again, and every time he passes an empty gas station, he feels a chill run down his spine, because some stops are more than just places to refuel. Some stops are gateways to something far darker. And there you have it, 5 chilling pit stop stories you'll wish weren't true. Each of these tales serves as a reminder that what seems ordinary, a gas station, a rest stop, a quiet road, can sometimes hide the extraordinary and the terrifying. These stories aren't just about fear, they're about vigilance. How many of us take these moments for granted? Stopping for gas, stretching our legs, grabbing a snack, it's all part of the journey, isn't it? But these experiences remind us to stay alert, trust our instincts, and recognize that danger doesn't always announce itself. It often creeps in when we least expect it. Take Emma's story, for example. What started as a routine stop to fill her tank turned into a desperate escape from a stalker. Or Chris, who encountered something unexplainable in a desolate gas station, an experience so unsettling that he avoids isolated stops to this day. Mark's harrowing chase by a phantom truck serves as a chilling reminder that not all dangers are flesh and blood. Lena's encounter at a rest stop, though less supernatural, was just as terrifying, as it showcased how vulnerable we can be in secluded places. And then there's Jacob, whose skeptical mind was shattered by an encounter with something he couldn't explain, a haunting figure that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. These aren't just isolated incidents, they're part of a broader narrative about the unpredictability of life on the road. For those of us who find comfort in the mundane, it's unsettling to realize how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary, and not in a good way. But there's a lesson in every story. Maybe it's as simple as locking your doors, staying in well-lit areas, or never ignoring that gut feeling that tells you something isn't right. Or perhaps it's a reminder of the power of storytelling itself, a way to share experiences, warn others, and keep each other safe. Stories like these are more than just entertainment. They're cautionary tales that remind us of the importance of awareness, preparation, and a little healthy skepticism. Before you head out on your next trip, take a moment to think about these stories. They're not meant to scare you off the road entirely. After all, life's greatest adventures often happen when you step out of your comfort zone. But it's worth remembering that awareness and preparation are just as important as curiosity and courage. Whether it's a late-night drive or a quick stop on a long journey, staying vigilant can make all the difference. So the next time you find yourself at a lonely gas station, an isolated rest stop, or a quiet stretch of highway, keep your wits about you. Look around, trust your instincts, and remember these stories. Because while most stops are uneventful, it only takes one strange encounter to change everything. These tailies aren't just warnings, they're also reminders of how powerful human intuition can be. Emma trusted her gut and got away safely. Chris acted quickly and avoided further danger. Mark's decision to seek safety in a populated area saved him from whatever was chasing him. And Lena's quick thinking at the second rest stop ensured she wasn't followed further. Even Jacob, despite his disbelief, relied on instinct to escape the unexplainable. If there's one thing we can learn from these stories, it's that trust in yourself is often the best course of action. If you enjoyed these stories, or if you've experienced something similar, let us know in the comments below. And if you have your own eerie tailies from the road, we'd love to hear them. Sharing these experiences not only keeps the conversation alive, but also helps others stay informed and prepared. Before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who love a good scare, and subscribe to the channel for more chilling content. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open and your doors locked. You never know what's waiting just beyond the shadows.